Hello everyone, this is Dr. Ilyas from the Department of Education, Hazara University, Mansehra. Today I want to share with you an important aspect of the process of literature review, and that is the sources of literature review. So the central question around which this presentation revolves is what are the sources of literature review, and where do we find literature, or how do we find literature related to our research topic. So let's begin. Well, there are two main sources of literature review: the primary sources of literature review and the secondary sources of literature review. The primary sources are sources that carry original or first hand information, often by authors, researchers, or creators. Examples of this kind of sources are original books. So if you have access to the original book related to your area of research. Similarly, original research papers and reports, autobiographies, diaries, speeches, letters, and creative works and other stuff in its original form. So if you have access to these as in their original form, they will become primary sources for you as a researcher. The secondary sources then are the second-hand accounts of the primary sources. So secondary sources include sources such as reviews. So you find reviews, and then in those reviews you find references to the primary sources. You don't have access to the primary sources, but you include the summaries or the critical reviews included in the secondary sources in your own literature review. And these also include critiques or discussions of the previous of the primary sources, and similarly interpretations and reports of the primary sources. So the secondary sources actually are based on the primary sources, but as a researcher you don't have access to the primary sources, so your dependence is mainly on the secondary sources. Now, both the primary sources and the secondary sources have certain possible strengths of inclusion in your literature review, and some possible issues as well. So the strengths of the primary sources include authenticity. It's more authentic because you are referring to the primary source. That means you have access to the primary source, and that makes the process more authentic. Then it's also, there is the element of reliability, because you are directly accessing and referring to the primary sources, so there is more reliability in that. The third thing is access to the primary sources may also give you more depth of understanding, because you actually read or listen to the primary source in more detail in its original form, and that might give you more in-depth understanding. And then the primary sources are more comprehensive accounts of a topic or an issue as compared to secondary sources. And the next thing is that it gives you the kind of the ability to rely on yourself as a thinker, or as a critic of the primary sources. There could be possible issues as well, and the first important issue, especially for junior researchers, if they want to include, especially students, if they want to include primary sources in their literature review, might be the difficulty in comprehending. In some cases, the primary sources are written by people who are highly accomplished, who might have a philosophical bent of mind, whose writing style may be difficult, and that might make it difficult for the junior researchers or student researchers to actually comprehend the primary sources. So this could be a problem of it. Similarly, access could be an issue. In many cases, it's difficult to have access to primary sources. This is the case with students who study in universities where the library system or the resource, the digital system are not very well accomplished, and so you might have problems of access to the primary sources. Then the primary sources are also time consuming, because in many cases if you want to read like a whole book to refer to in your thesis, it might become quite difficult. In contrast to this, if you go and find secondary sources that might have shorter summaries of the primary sources, so that could be better. And then the cost, of course, the cost as well. In many cases, access to primary sources will be quite expensive, so that might also be an issue. Then secondary sources also have certain benefits and certain possible issues. The benefits include ease of access. It's easy to have, it might be easy to have relatively easier access to the secondary sources. Then the cost effectiveness. In many cases, secondary sources might be cost effective or better for less knowledgeable readers. Again, less knowledgeable readers who do not have in-depth understanding of that particular field, especially in the beginning of their research as student researchers. It might be better to go for secondary sources who will be more accessible in terms of language or presentation and things like that. And then learning from the interpretation of other academics and reviewers might help the junior or less knowledgeable researchers. And again, it could be time saving, because you might go into certain particular areas of the research rather than studying or reading whole sources for it. And then the possible issues that we could have in secondary sources include authenticity. In some cases, it might not be very authentic. The account of someone else about a primary source might not be very authentic. They might make mistakes over there in the interpretation, and then because you are depending on the other people's interpretation of the primary sources, there might have been issues of authenticity. Chances of being misled, less chances of deeper insights. Again, because you are not going for the primary sources in more in-depth, so you might have the issue of having less deeper insights, and you are depending on others. So these could be possible issues. So in conclusion, we can say that there should usually be, and there actually is usually a combination of the primary and secondary sources when it comes to the literature reviews. Most examiners and supervisors, or those who oversee research studies, might want more of the primary sources and less of the secondary sources, but there will always be a combination of these two types of resources. Here is an example to understand the primary sources of a reference. So here is a reference in my own thesis, and the reference is to Moon 1999. So as the primary source, because I read this book of Moon 1999 and I had access to it, so I use it as a primary source. And so in this one, in this reference, you can see that I have quoted from Moon 1999 on page 4. Similarly, this second example is also from my thesis, and here I have used Dewey's ideas, and because that idea was referred to in Pollard and 10, 1987, so I didn't read the Dewey's original book, but I went to, but I had access to Pollard and 10, so I studied that and I referred to that. In this type of, so this becomes a kind of secondary source for me, because I have taken this quote from the book of Pollard and 10 rather than Dewey himself. So this is an example of that. And in the full reference, when you are giving the primary source, so you give the full reference over there in the reference list. In a secondary, as a secondary source, when you use, you don't need to give a reference of the primary source. You just need to give a reference of the secondary source, which has actually referred to the primary source. So the Polar and 10 1987 full reference is the secondary source, and that is what you need in your full reference list. Okay. Now I want to just briefly mention some of the databases or sources of information or material from where usually student researchers or junior researchers or general researchers in general actually might get sources of data for their literature review. So usually in the current age, people generally, especially students, begin with a search on the internet, and the internet is quite an accessible source of information. There might be issues of authenticity, but still that's the beginning point. Then the Google Scholar is also a source of a lot of database, and we have, especially in the field of education, this Education Resource Information Center, or ERIC, is an interesting and very useful source of database, and it actually has kind of hundreds of thousands of sources. Many of those are freely available. ProQuest is also a source of a database which includes research papers and also research theses. Also, there are certain websites such as academia where academics have put their own research and are openly available. ResearchGate is another such website where university academics have actually they can upload their research papers, and so students can have access to that. And there are other professional websites, there are open library sites, and then of course many students might have university websites of their own universities, especially in the most developed established universities. And of course the physical libraries, which are actually becoming more and more obsolete now. So these are like different sources of databases that you can use for your research, and especially for your literature review. I hope this presentation was useful for you. If you have any questions or comments, please share in the comment section. Many thanks for your time and attention. Take care.